of the uprising in Syria. At the time, longtime strongmen had fallen in Tunisia and Egypt. A civil war had just erupted in Libya. There were protests in Bahrain and Yemen. Few, though, expected Syria to erupt. What began as street protests in Deraa did indeed, though, quickly spread. What followed was a slow and seeming inevitable slide into civil war, complete with indiscriminate shelling of urban areas, assassinations, and jihadist militias. 70,000 killed, 3.5 million refugees and displaced later. France 24 went and spoke with key Syria watchers. In a special report you're about to watch, along with our panels, we're joining us a little bit later on. She's reported for France 24 with the rebels in Damascus. Sofia AMARA will be joining us from Beirut. Here in the studio, William Jordan, former political officer at the U.S. Embassy in Damascus. Thank you for being back with us in the debate. Thanks as well for being back with us, Ayssar Midani of the pro-Assad Union of Syrian Patriots. Thank you for being with us. And joining us is Ismael Hashem, Syrian opposition activist. The France 24 debate, where you can always join the conversation on Facebook and on Twitter, our hashtag F24debate. Before we go to our panel, though, let's go straight to that feature prepared for reporters, the France 24 investigative news magazine.
With his European qualifications and charming wife, it's no wonder Bashar al-Assad wore a wide smile. In 2000, after 30 years of dictatorship under Hafez al-Assad, it looked like Damascus was ready to start opening up to the world. There was widespread hope that the new leader would bring in political reform. But for the past 2 years, Bashar has shown himself to be even more bloodthirsty than his father.
Syria is now like a big prison, a slaughterhouse.
For this program, we've talked to those who've known Bashar al-Assad closely and those who are fighting against him to understand why, 2 years after the Arab Spring, Syria is still in flames.
He thinks the more violence he uses, the more his popularity will increase. He's a sick man.
It feels like the system has gone mad. It's now based on criminality and blind cruelty.
Bashar al-Assad is a nationalistic man. He thinks about his country, about his people.
Everyone, including the Russians, know there will be no solution without the departure of Assad.
Back in March 2011, the young people of Deraa, close to the border with Jordan, may have felt they were at the threshold of something that would change their country, but not a revolution that would become a full-blown civil war.
Everything started in Syria because of a child who saw his father cry because of a problem he had with a business partner. The child was mad with grief and anger for his dad, and so the next day he wrote on the walls, "Death to Ali," I don't know who. And then the rest of his class came over and wrote, "Death to the tyrant, death to Bashar al-Assad."
15, 16 and 17-year-old kids were immediately abducted, imprisoned and tortured. Orders that came straight from Damascus.
Some were killed. And after that, the regime lost all chance of turning back.
The story made its way around the country, fueling the anger of a people at boiling point. One Bedouin went to see the local governor directly to plead for the release of the children.
He took the keffiyeh off his head, put it on the table and said, "My honour is in your hands, give us back our children." Some say that the governor of Dera took his keffiyeh, threw it in the bin and told him, "Forget your children, make some more. If you can't, send us your women and we will do it for you." And with that, it was done.
Atef Najib, a cousin of Bashar al-Assad, was then the head of security for the state of Dera. Despite his blunt threats, protesters continued to fill the streets, perhaps inspired by other Arab Spring demonstrations across the region. Najib called up his other cousin, Maher, the brother of the president. Maher was in charge of the feared 4th Division of the Republican Guard and sent his troops into the town. 2 weeks later, the helicopters moved in.
It kicked off in one region after another, and then the violence spread.
The activists were mostly young. These were lightning bolt events that took place in only 10, 15 minutes. People then needed to disperse quickly.
From the very first day, the regime showed no mercy on these peaceful demonstrations, opening fire on them at will. Hamza al-Khatib, only 13 years old, was to become the face of this cruelty. According to the opposition, he was picked up at the Dera demonstrations and tortured to death by the secret police. His body, unlike countless others, then reappeared.
A tortured child, his genitals mutilated, his eyes gouged out, his body riddled with bullets, was returned to his parents after a month.
The regime and its allies, including Iran, deny these accusations. They claim that Hamza al-Khatib was not tortured at all and that he died in a firefight between regime soldiers and armed fighters.
It's unacceptable for us to hear that the Syrian government tortures children in the hunt for fighters. These are men or terrorists who are apparently there and have been provoking them. It's just not true.
But the denials did not calm the street. Like Mohamed Bouazizi before him in Tunisia, or Khaled Said in Egypt, Hamza al-Khatib became a symbol of the revolution. His image was carried as a banner by protesters across the nation.
Of course his murder had a goal, to terrorize people, but it had the opposite effect.
The fact that he was treated in such a brutal way meant that members of the army who had been planning to desert couldn't stand it anymore and took up arms against the regime.
Syria had been set ablaze. Even if the core of the system remained secure, the army was seeing desertions by the bucket load. Damascus was forced to turn to its allies Iran and Lebanese Hezbollah. Witnesses say they saw foreign fighters amongst the regime's troops.
We know, everyone knows it, that both Hezbollah and Iran are involved in the fighting, and this more and more.
In Lebanon, every week coffins arrive from Syria to be buried in South Lebanon and in the Bekaa Valley. Hezbollah fighters in coffins are buried discreetly, brought from the north, which is not an area associated with their designated enemy, Israel.
Military operations are being run by the Iranians. There are elite forces from the Iranian Revolutionary Guard fighting on the side of the regime.
Iran has categorically denied any military presence, but Tehran has nevertheless admitted a measure of involvement in the Syrian conflict.
Regarding military men, it's not true. We're there to give them necessary advice to help them get through this period. Above all in the economic and commercial sectors. We have a close strategic relationship with Syria. It's a historic relationship, and we're sympathetic to them.
We've become a battleground for regional powers to fight other regional powers.
While these different battles raged in Syria, the international community struggled in vain to find a solution. Diplomatic meetings disintegrated with no solid conclusions. The UN may have reached agreement over Libya in 2011, but this time China and Russia blocked any mention of intervention or sanctions against Damascus.
We hadn't seen anything like this since the end of the Cold War. Russia has successively vetoed 3 resolutions that didn't impose sanctions against Assad, resolutions that only threatened to impose them.
They had a bad experience with the vote to adopt a resolution on Libya. They felt bitter about it. It's what happened after this resolution that's stopping them today. They don't want a history to repeat itself.
Russia has major interests in Syria. That includes arms sales, their naval base. It's in some way their last foothold in the Arab world, because 40 years ago they were forced out of most of the Arab world.
In contrast to Libya, the opposition in Syria was not united. Men fighting on the ground in Syria felt too disconnected from those who were talking to the media in their name outside the country. This opposition in exile first took form as the Syrian National Council, itself divided into opposing factions. Its representatives denied any responsibility for the stalemate.
Even if all the opposition spoke with one voice today, Bashar al-Assad would still not fall. What we see on the ground is that without outside help, we don't have anything that can stand up to Assad's regime's forces. The divisions within the Syrian opposition mirror those of the international community.
In November 2012, more than a year and a half since the start of the revolution, all the different opposition groups gathered in Qatar. Under pressure from US diplomats, they came together to form a united front, the Syrian National Coalition. France, then other countries, quickly recognized this body as the legitimate representative of the Syrian people.
What's the point of recognition? 160 countries have recognized the PLO. But what has this recognition done for the Palestinians? Does it prevent Israeli expansion into the West Bank? Does it give any rights to the Palestinians?
Abdel Halim Haddam was at the core of the regime under Hafez and then Bashar al-Assad. He knew how it functioned and its weaknesses. After defecting in 2005 because he was sidelined, his is one of the rare voices calling for an international military intervention. He says that's the only way to topple the regime and end the impasse at the UN.
Why has the international community remained silent? For world peace? Were they not concerned for world peace when they bombed Kosovo, despite a Russian veto in the Security Council? Were they not concerned for world peace when they intervened in Yugoslavia, against the wishes of the Russians? Why not for Syria? That's the question.
Taking lessons from Vice President Haddam, who was a member of the Assad regime for 40 years, is quite galling. However, saying that the question of military intervention is legitimate, I don't see any country ready to hand over their men's lives for this kind of business.
Look at what we're fighting with. Against airplanes, tanks and rockets.
The international community has not only refused to engage militarily like it did in Libya, it's also blocked arms deliveries to the rebels up until now. The West fears these arms could fall into the wrong hands, in other words, radical Islamists.
It had the opposite effect. Radical Islam has come in and is now seeing a meteoric rise amongst the Free Syrian Army and other revolutionaries on the ground.
It needs a commitment from and the support of the international community, and also from countries in the region, to stop the delivery of arms and money to certain armed groups.
The only countries that have more or less admitted arming the rebels are Saudi Arabia and Qatar. What is worrying about that is that these countries tend to support and arm those elements who are close to Salafism and the Muslim Brotherhood. The Salafists for Saudi Arabia and the Muslim Brotherhood for Qatar.
That has no basis. Saudi Arabia and Qatar have not spent a single dollar on weapons and military support for the Syrian revolution.
The West also knows that insurgents themselves have blood on their hands. Several human rights organizations have accused the rebel forces of abuses, including, as we see in this footage, summary executions. Apart from small arms and a few surface-to-air rockets, the Free Syrian Army has so far not had the means to tip the balance of power. Pro-Assad voices claim the regime has not fallen because the majority of Syrian people support it, and that it's nothing to do with the inaction of the international community.
We hear that tomorrow Bashar al-Assad will leave. He'll fall. It'll be over. But it's not like that, because the reality is that Bashar al-Assad is supported by the majority of the Syrian people, and he's still there because they still support him.
Insurgents now control some parts of the country. In July 2012, the Deputy Minister for Defense was killed in a bomb attack in Damascus. Asef Jokat was Bashar's brother-in-law. He died alongside Defense Minister Daoud Raja. For a brief moment, the rebels had taken the battle into the heart of the Syrian capital and were right on the doorstep of the country's central command.
His destiny will be that of Muammar Gaddafi's.
Definitely, Bashar al-Assad fears for his life. It goes without saying that the rebels have targeted the presidential palace several times with the dream of ending the days of the one they call the tyrant.
He's afraid. The proof is that he doesn't sleep 2 nights in the same place. He doesn't eat any food before the cooks have tasted it. And he eats off their dishes.
Those who know Bashar al-Assad nearly all say he will only go with force. In other words, we're looking at the same scenario as Muammar Gaddafi. It's quite scary because if he leaves in this way, it's likely the violence will carry on.
Violence that risks gripping the country for a long time to come.
الله أكبر إطلاق رصاص عند الظاهرين الله أكبر الله أكبر.
After Deraa, Homs and Hama, in summer 2012, the city of Aleppo became the main front of the conflict. It took many months for demonstrations to appear here in the economic capital of the country. Once again, the regime replied with heavy arms. All amateur videos coming out of Syria are hard to authenticate, but sometimes they show surreal and hard-to-believe scenes. Like this one, of a soldier appearing to use a cigarette to light a missile, seemingly packed with explosives, before throwing it down onto a village. Those fighting against him believe in the inevitable fall of the regime, and yet it still stands. More than a year ago, both the rebels and the West were saying the end was near.
I think the problems will start when Bashar al-Assad's regime falls in Syria, because the international community has waited too long.
It's now clear that the fall of Bashar al-Assad will not mean the instant salvation of Syria. 2 years of fighting has brought the country to its knees. The cities have mostly been destroyed. The dead are counted in their tens of thousands. The political opposition remains divided, and the economy is on the point of collapse. Still worse, tensions within and between communities threaten to maintain a cycle of violence with no end. Many experts fear that the Alawite minority, in power for 40 years, will be targeted by a Sunni majority. The country's Christian minority also fears for its destiny. Meanwhile, the regime itself has promised not to go down without a fight.
The international community has not heard this message, but those at the head of the regime have been heard saying, "We will burn everything before we leave office."
The international community will enter a Syria in ruins, on its knees, with a society absolutely drenched in blood. A time when inter-community hatred and a desire for revenge will be at its peak.
They must remain one people, a people who can come together once again.
In Syria, there is a new generation that cannot be ignored. Nobody can ignore the ambitions of this generation.
A new generation which, if it succeeds in bringing down the government, will not only have to rebuild a political system, but an entire country.
And that